This is Devonte Stanford. He was locked up for the murder of 4 people when he was just 15 years old. In 2007, when Stanford was only 14 years old, he was charged and convicted in Detroit. His confession was allegedly coerced into being made at a Detroit drug den. Several blocks from the crime scene, Stanford was arrested while he was standing outside his home in pajamas. The confession was made after 2 days of interrogation without a parent or guardian present. Stanford pleaded guilty at the advice of his attorney and was sentenced to 37 to 90 years in prison. After a few weeks, another man confessed to the shooting, but Stanford remained in prison. Stanford was sentenced to a minimum of 39 years in prison, despite being blind in one eye, unable to read or write, and making numerous attempts to retract his confession. The State Appellate Defender Office eventually found out about Stanford's confession and tried to get Stanford to drop his plea, but to no avail. In 2014, the Michigan Innocence Clinic and the Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth took on the case, urging the Michigan State Police to reopen the investigation into the murders. After another man, a professional hitman, confessed to the murders, it became clear that Devonte, who was 14 at the time, was not involved in any way. He finally told the truth, even though he was already serving 52 years in prison for 8 other murders, and he told detectives that he would never take on someone like Stanford as a sidekick. Devonte's wrongful conviction received international attention due to Devonte's young age and the potential misconduct that precipitated his conviction. The police who worked the original case were accused of making mistakes that led to the teenager's conviction. The Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Brian Sullivan ordered Stanford to be released and his conviction vacated. At the time of his release, Stanford, who was 23 years old, was reunited with his mother, brother, and sister outside the courtroom. When Stanford finally gets to make his long-awaited journey back home, he smiles quietly to himself as he walks out of prison. He later spoke to the press, stating that he never doubted that one day he would be a free man. This is Stephen Avery. He was sentenced in 1985 to 32 years in prison for the rape and attempted murder of a female jogger. Avery's case is perhaps the most famous example of an innocent man being released from prison. He served 18 years until new DNA testing proved that Avery was innocent of the crime in 2003. Much to the delight of his mother, he was finally released. By the time Avery finally won his freedom, his wife had divorced him and the twin sons he had just before his arrest were grown. However, Avery emphasized that he does not feel anger towards the woman who wrongly accused him. He was clearly overjoyed to be free. The press interview proves that forgiveness is possible in the most devastating of circumstances, and his focus is enjoying a second chance at life. The 2003 exoneration of Avery sparked a lot of discussion about Wisconsin's criminal justice system. The Criminal Justice Reform Bill, which was passed into law in 2005, made changes to prevent future wrongly convicted people. Avery filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County, its former sheriff, and its former district attorney for wrongful conviction and imprisonment after his release. Avery is currently behind bars for the alleged murder of another woman just 2 years after his arrest, as fans of the Netflix series Making a Murderer may know. Avery's murder trial and subsequent conviction of his nephew, Brendan Dassey, are the focus of the Netflix documentary series. This is Ricky Jackson. As a young man in Cleveland, Ohio, he was wrongfully convicted of murder and convicted to death. Jackson was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1977, but was commuted. Ricky, along with 2 others, Ronnie Bridgman and Wiley Bridgman, who were suspected of as accomplices to Jackson, were exonerated in late 2014, having been in prison for decades. Jackson was imprisoned for 39 years on this wrongful conviction, according to the National Registry of Exoneration. This was thought to be the longest record for someone who had been found innocent. After an appeals court ruled that the jury had received incorrect instructions in their cases, the death sentence of Jackson commuted to life imprisonment. Jackson was released on November 21, 2014, after the key witness in their jury trial said he had changed his story during a hearing at Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. In 2015 and 2016, Jackson received several $1 million in settlements from the state to compensate him for his imprisonment and lost wages due to his wrongful convictions. Eugene Johnson, Derek Wheat, and Laurice Glover, also known as the East Cleveland Three, were finally released in 2015 after spending 20 years behind bars for a murder none of them committed. The truth would come out after the three men were locked up for shooting a teenager, Clifton Hudson Jr., to death in 1995. When it was discovered that the two leading officers had violated the civil rights of the men, it was found that they had withheld police reports containing favorable witness statements. They'd also been found to have coerced a 14-year-old witness into giving a false testimony against the men. Later, the witness retracted their statement, and the men's lawyers also found evidence that someone else was the shooter that was kept out of court. A judge who had been following their case since the beginning of her career granted the men their freedom after 20 years. Their families celebrated in court and gave emotional interviews to the press after living a nightmare for so long, and they cried tears of relief. Three East Cleveland men who spent 2 decades in prison for a murder they didn't commit were awarded $5 million each. After an investigation into them for the 1995 murder, the 11 jurors ruled that former East Cleveland officers Vincent Johnstone and Michael Perry violated the civil rights of Laurice Glover, Eugene Johnson, and Derek Wheat. Following deliberations that ensued a trial in U.S. District Judge James Gwynn's courtroom, the verdict was reached. The men said that detectives withheld a police report of witness statements that were in favor and forced a 14-year-old witness to say that the trio was involved in the death of Cliff Hudson Jr. This is Raymond Tower. On September 18, 1981, he was convicted of rape, kidnapping, and assault. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for rape. He was also given additional sentences of 7 to 25 years and 5 to 25 years. 2 children, aged 12 and 11, were coaxed into a wooded area in the Rocky River Reservation in Cleveland, Ohio in May 1981. The boy was assaulted and the girl was raped. 3 weeks after the incident, a park ranger stopped Raymond Tower during a routine traffic stop and found that he matched the description of the suspect. The victims and other witnesses saw Tower in a photo lineup, and even though he had an alibi, he was sent to prison for life. In 2004, a judge ordered DNA testing when prosecutors asked Relia Jean, a private lab in New Orleans, to send a pubic hair from the victim to be tested. The envelope came back empty. On February 5, 2008, Tower requested an additional DNA testing. Results from the DNA test of the semen-stained underwear on November 5, 2008 showed partial genetic profiles of 2 males, neither of whom were consistent with Tower. Even though the DNA was not a match for Tower, the prosecutors said that the results were not conclusive and said that there was DNA from 2 people on the underwear. When it was decided that there was only one attacker, on May 4, 2010, the DNA testing of the semen and skin cells independently proved Tower's innocence. Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court Judge Eileen A. Gallagher vacated the convictions of rape, kidnapping, and felonious assault on May 5, 2010, and Tower was released from graft. The judge and Tower's representatives fought back tears, but the man himself just said, "Wow," before giving a positive interview. This is Susan Mellon. In 1997, Mellon, a mother of 3, was wrongly accused for killing Rick Daley. At the time, Susan was living with her boyfriend Tom and her 2 youngest children, Jessica, age 9, and Donnie, age 7. She was a loving and gentle mother who succumbed to pressure to use methamphetamine in her early 30s. The next 10 years, she continued to use intermittently. In 1996, after her relationship with the kid's father ended, Susan dated Rick Daley for a short time. However, the relationship ended when Rick went to jail. Rick was good to her and her children. Susan had been dating Tom for several months when she needed to move out of her mother's house, and she met Tom in January 1997. Susan and her children eventually moved in with Tom in his Redondo Beach apartment. Susan and Tom found a house in Gardena in July of that year. After Tom got notice that he was being evicted from the apartment on the day of the incident, Tom was at work, so Susan, her daughter Jessica, and Tom's father Jim packed boxes and moved many of the smaller items into Susan's car and Jim's truck. Susan and Jim were with Jessica throughout the day and evening. The Lawndale gang members were present in an abandoned house many miles away when one or more of them savagely attacked Rick Daley. Although Mellon was convicted solely based on the testimony of an alleged witness, her defense team argued repeatedly that there were numerous inconsistencies with the statement. In 2014, she was released from prison after serving 17 years for a murder she didn't commit. Mellon of Los Angeles was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Mellon's eldest of 3 children was left to raise her younger siblings while she tried to get her mom out of prison. When Mellon gave an interview to the press just after her release, she was filled with forgiveness and hope. She told the crowd that she never lost hope that one day she would be freed, even though she was overwhelmed by her freedom. One of the gang members was convicted of the killing. 3 other gang members were eventually linked to the crime.